Everyone thought Jasmine Crockett would get crushed on Joe Rogan's podcast. After all, Rogan was a master of this game, with 50 million listeners hanging on his every word. But that night, Jasmine didn't just deliver a performance that would go down in podcast history. She delivered one that would reshape American politics. And Rogan, he'd never be able to speak the same way again. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning in March 2025. Jasmine was in her congressional office reviewing housing legislation when her chief of staff, Marcus, walked in with a look she'd never seen before. "You're not going to believe this," he said, holding up his phone. "Joe Rogan wants you on his podcast." Jasmine looked up from her papers. "Joe Rogan? The UFC guy who thinks vaccines are a government conspiracy." "The very same. His team reached out this morning. Says he wants to have a real conversation about politics with someone who isn't afraid to speak their mind." Jasmine leaned back in her chair. She knew what this was. Rogan had been taking heat for months about only having right-wing politicians and controversial figures on his show. Bringing her on would be his way of saying, "See, I platform everyone." "It's obviously a setup," Marcus continued. "He's going to try to make you look radical, uninformed, or both. His audience eats that stuff up." But Jasmine was already thinking 3 steps ahead. When does he want to do it? This Friday, prime time, they're calling it a special edition. "Tell them yes." Marcus nearly dropped his phone. "Jasmine, think about this. This isn't some friendly cable news interview. This is 3 hours with a guy who's made a career out of making people look foolish. His audience is mostly white men between 18 and 45 who think you're everything wrong with politics." Jasmine stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the Capitol dome. "Marcus, how many times have we talked about meeting people where they are instead of where we wish they were? This is different. Rogan's not interested in good faith dialogue. He's interested in content, and content means conflict. Then let's give him content he wasn't expecting." That evening, Jasmine did something she rarely did. She called her grandmother. "Grandmama, I need to ask you something." "What's on your mind, baby?" If you had a chance to speak to a room full of people who had never heard your story, who maybe even thought they didn't like you before you opened your mouth, would you take it? Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. "Child, that's been my whole life. Every room I ever walked into as a black woman in Texas, people had already decided who I was before I said a word. What did you do? I spoke anyway. And I spoke my truth, not theirs. Even when you knew they might try to tear you down. Especially then. Because, baby, the people who are really listening, the ones who matter, they can tell the difference between someone speaking truth and someone performing for cameras." 3 days later, Jasmine walked into Rogan's Austin studio. The place was designed to feel casual, exposed brick, dim lighting, a small table with 2 microphones. But she could feel the energy. This wasn't casual. This was calculated. Rogan greeted her with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Representative Crockett, thanks for coming on. I have to say, I was surprised when your team said yes." "Why's that?" "Well, let's be honest. Your politics and my audience don't exactly align." Jasmine settled into her chair, adjusting her microphone. "Maybe that's exactly why I'm here." "All right, let's get into it." Rogan leaned forward, a familiar gleam in his eyes. "So Jasmine, can I call you Jasmine?" "Of course." "You've been pretty vocal about systemic racism, wealth inequality, police reform. Some would say you're pushing a pretty radical agenda." Here it was, the first test. Rogan was already trying to frame her as extreme before she'd even explained her positions. "Joe, can I ask you something first?" "Sure. How do you define radical?" Rogan paused, clearly not expecting the question to be turned around. "I guess policies or ideas that represent a major departure from the norm." "Okay, so by that definition, was the 40-hour workweek radical when it was first proposed?" "I mean, yeah, probably." "How about Social Security? Medicare? The Civil Rights Act?" Rogan was starting to look uncomfortable. "Where are you going with this?" "I'm going to a place where we acknowledge that what sounds radical to one generation becomes common sense to the next. But more importantly, I'm going to a place where we stop using radical as a way to dismiss ideas without actually examining them. But come on, some of your proposals. Which ones? Well, like defunding the police. Jasmine smiled. She'd been waiting for this one. Joe, I've never advocated for defunding the police. But you've supported police reform. Absolutely. I've supported reallocating portions of police budgets toward mental health services, education, and community programs. You know why? Why? Because I spent 3 years as a public defender. I've seen what happens when we ask police officers to be social workers, mental health counselors, and educators all at once. It's not fair to them, and it doesn't work for the communities they serve. Rogan was quiet for a moment. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. Jasmine continued, Joe, how many police officers do you know personally? A few, I guess. I know dozens. You know what they tell me? They didn't sign up to handle mental health crises with no training. They didn't sign up to deal with homelessness and addiction with no resources. They want to focus on actual crime, and they want communities to have the support systems that prevent crime in the first place. So you're saying police reform is actually pro-police? I'm saying police reform is pro-everyone. It's pro-officer, pro-community, and pro-public safety. Rogan sat back. Okay, that's actually a reasonable way to frame it. But what about your stance on capitalism? You've been pretty critical of the free market system. Have I? Or have I been critical of a system where a full-time worker can't afford a one-bedroom apartment in most American cities? But that's just economics, supply and demand. Joe, let me ask you this. You live in Austin, right? Yeah. What was Austin like when you moved here versus now? Completely different. It's way more expensive now. A lot of the local character has been replaced by chain stores and luxury developments. And how does that make you feel? Honestly, kind of sad. It was a unique place and now it's becoming like everywhere else. Right. So you understand that unchecked market forces can destroy the things that make communities special. You understand that there's a difference between a free market and a predatory market. Yeah, I guess I do. That's all I'm talking about. I'm not anti-capitalism. I'm anti-exploitation. I'm not against people getting rich. I'm against people getting rich by making sure other people stay poor. For the first time since the interview started, Rogan looked genuinely interested rather than combative. But don't you think, he said, that some of these problems would fix themselves if government just got out of the way? Jasmine had been hoping he'd go here. Joe, can I tell you a story? Sure. When I was 8 years old, my mom got sick. Really sick. She had insurance through her job, but it didn't cover her medications. We're talking about a single mom working 2 jobs, and she had to choose between paying for her heart medication and paying rent. What did she do? She went without the medication for 3 months, nearly had a stroke. Jesus. Now, Joe, how would getting government out of the way have helped my mom in that situation? Rogan was quiet. The insurance company had a government-granted monopoly in our area. The pharmaceutical company had government-granted patents that kept cheaper alternatives off the market. My mom's employer was using government tax incentives to provide the bare minimum health coverage. Government wasn't the problem. It was which interests the government was serving. So your solution is more government involvement. My solution is government that works for working people instead of just wealthy people. That's not more government or less government. That's different government. Rogan nodded slowly. Okay, I can see that. But what about cancel culture? You've got to admit that there's a problem with people losing their careers over old tweets or jokes. Jasmine had been waiting for this topic too. Joe, who exactly is getting canceled? Well, comedians, actors, people who express unpopular opinions. Can you name someone who lost their career permanently over a tweet? Rogan thought for a moment. There are lots of examples. Name one. Well, people get attacked online all the time. Getting criticized online isn't the same as getting canceled, Joe. Can you name one person who made a mistake, apologized sincerely, and never worked again? Rogan was struggling. Because I can name people who've actually been canceled. Jasmine continued. Colin Kaepernick lost his NFL career for peacefully protesting police brutality. The Dixie Chicks lost their country music careers for criticizing the Iraq War. These are people who were blacklisted for expressing political opinions, not for making mistakes. But what about accountability culture going too far? I agree that people should have room to grow and learn from mistakes. But here's my question. Who decides what too far means? Usually, it's the people who've never had to worry about being harmed by the words or actions they're defending. What do you mean? Joe, if someone makes a joke about sexual assault and survivors of sexual assault say that's harmful, who should get to decide whether their concerns are valid, the comedian or the survivors? That's complicated. It is complicated. But it's not complicated because accountability is bad. It's complicated because we're finally having conversations about harm that we never used to have. Rogan was starting to look uncomfortable again, but for different reasons this time. Let me ask you something, Joe. Have you ever had to worry about a joke or comment ending your career? I mean, sure, I guess. No, really. Have you ever lost sleep wondering if something you said would get you fired, blacklisted, or physically threatened? Not really, no. Right. Because you're Joe Rogan. You have 50 million listeners and a $100 million Spotify deal. You can say almost anything and your career will be fine. But for a lot of people, especially women, people of color, LGBTQ+ folks, every public statement is calculated because the stakes are so much higher. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't until they have to. They sat in silence for a moment. Jasmine could see something shifting in Rogan's expression. Can I ask you something personal? Rogan said. Go ahead. How do you deal with the hate? I see some of the stuff people say about you online, and it's really vicious. The same way you deal with it, I imagine. You remember why you're doing this in the first place. But it's different for you. The attacks are more personal. You mean racist and sexist? Yeah, they are. But Joe, here's the thing I've learned. The people who send that kind of hatred, they're not actually angry at me. They're angry at what I represent, which is change, progress. The idea that power doesn't have to stay in the same hands forever. Does that make it easier? It makes it meaningful. When someone calls me the N-word because I'm fighting for affordable health care, I know I'm over the target. Rogan was quiet for a long moment. You know, I have to admit something. When my team suggested having you on, I thought it would be different. You thought you'd trip me up with gotcha questions and I'd look foolish? Yeah, kind of. And now? Now I'm wondering if I've been getting my information about you from the wrong sources. Jasmine leaned forward. Joe, can I tell you the real reason I came on your show? Yeah. Because I knew your audience had probably never heard from someone like me directly. They'd heard about me, heard interpretations of my positions, heard sound bites taken out of context, but they'd never heard me explain my own thinking in my own words. And you thought that would matter. I thought some of them might be willing to listen, and I thought some of them might discover that the boogeyman they've been told about doesn't actually exist. What exists instead? A woman from Texas who believes that everyone deserves a fair shot, that government should work for working people, and that we can disagree about solutions without demonizing each other. Rogan sat back in his chair. You know what? I think I owe my audience an apology. For what? For presenting them with caricatures instead of actual people, for booking guests based on their ability to generate controversy instead of their ability to generate understanding. Joe, that's not just your show, that's all of media. We've turned politics into entertainment and entertainment into politics. Everyone's performing their role instead of speaking their truth. So how do we fix it? We start by admitting that most people, regardless of their politics, want the same basic things. They want to feel safe, to be able to provide for their families, to have some hope that their kids will have better opportunities than they did. And then we stop letting politicians and media figures convince us that our neighbors are our enemies. Is that really possible in this environment? Joe, 3 hours ago, You thought I was a radical socialist who wanted to destroy America. What do you think now?" Rogan laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time in the interview. "I think you're a thoughtful person who I disagree with about some things and agree with about others." See? That wasn't so hard. But what about the people who will never listen? The people who are so locked into their worldview that no amount of evidence will change their minds? You don't do this for them. You do this for the people who are still curious, still open, still willing to learn. And Joe, that's more people than you think. How do you know? Because you're one of them. As the interview wound down, Rogan did something he rarely did. He became vulnerable on air. "Jasmine, I have to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Okay. Do you think I'm a bad person?" The question hung in the air. Jasmine could see that this wasn't performance. This was real. "Joe, I think you're a person who's been given an enormous platform, and you're trying to figure out how to use it responsibly. I think you care about truth, even when it's uncomfortable, and I think you're brave enough to admit when you're wrong. But I've amplified some really harmful ideas." "Yes, you have. But you've also created space for conversations that wouldn't happen anywhere else. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes. The question is what you do with the awareness of those mistakes. What would you do if you were me? I'd remember that with great power comes great responsibility, and I'd use that power to bring people together instead of driving them apart. Even people who disagree with you, especially people who disagree with me." When the podcast ended, something unprecedented happened. Rogan did something he'd never done before. He immediately recorded a follow-up segment for his audience. "I want to talk to you guys about what just happened," he said into the microphone after Jasmine had left. "I came into this interview with certain assumptions about Representative Crockett, and I was wrong. Not about everything. We still disagree on plenty of policy issues. But I was wrong about her character, her motivations, and her intelligence." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "I think I owe it to you, my audience, to be more careful about how I present people, especially people whose perspectives I don't initially understand. We can disagree with someone's politics without demonizing them as a person." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, clips from the interview were trending across every social media platform. But these weren't the usual angry, divisive clips that dominate political discourse. These were moments of genuine connection, understanding, and growth. Conservative commentators who had spent years attacking Jasmine found themselves struggling to explain why her positions seemed so reasonable when presented in context. Liberal commentators who had written off Rogan's audience as irredeemable found themselves reconsidering the possibility of bridge building. But the most powerful reactions came from ordinary people, Rogan's listeners who had never heard a progressive politician speak to them with respect rather than condescension, and Jasmine's supporters who had never seen a conservative platform allow a black woman to speak without interruption or distortion. "She didn't change my mind about everything," wrote one Rogan fan on Reddit, "but she changed my mind about her, and maybe that's a start." "I've been listening to Rogan for years," wrote another, "and I've never heard him be so humble, real. Whatever happened in that room, it was something special." The interview didn't solve American political polarization. It didn't end racism or sexism or the culture wars. But it did something perhaps more important. It reminded people that it's possible to disagree without being disagreeable, to challenge ideas without attacking humanity, and to find common ground without compromising core principles. 3 weeks later, Jasmine received a text from an unknown number. "Representative Crockett, this is Joe Rogan. I wanted you to know that I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. I'm planning to do more interviews like that one. Deeper, more honest, less performative. Thank you for showing me what that could look like." She texted back, "Thank you for being willing to listen. That's rarer than you think." But the story didn't end there. The reverberations from that single 3-hour conversation would continue to ripple through American media and politics for months to come. 2 days after Jasmine's text exchange with Rogan, she was sitting in a coffee shop near the Capitol when a young man approached her table. He was nervous, fidgeting with his phone, clearly working up the courage to speak. "Excuse me, Representative Crockett?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry to bother you, but I had to say something. I've been listening to Joe Rogan for like 5 years. I thought you guys were trying to destroy the country." Jasmine set down her coffee and looked at him directly. "What changed your mind?" "Hearing you talk. Like, actually talk. Not sound bites or Twitter posts, but just explaining why you believe what you believe." He paused, struggling for words. "I still don't agree with everything you said, but I get it now. You're not trying to hurt people. You're trying to help them." "What's your name?" "Tyler. Tyler Morrison." "Tyler, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Before you heard that interview, where were you getting your information about politicians like me?" "Mostly YouTube, I guess. Commentary channels, reaction videos, stuff like that." "And they showed you clips of me speaking?" "Yeah, but they were always the angry parts. The parts where you were fighting with other politicians or getting heated in committee hearings." "So you never heard me explain my actual positions? It was always like, look at this crazy woman screaming about socialism or whatever." Jasmine nodded. This was exactly what she'd suspected. "Tyler, thank you for telling me this. It matters more than you know." As Tyler walked away, Jasmine realized something profound had happened. The interview hadn't just changed how Rogan's audience saw her, it had changed how she understood the information ecosystem that was shaping American politics. That evening, she called Marcus. "I need you to set up meetings with YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter. I want to understand how their algorithms work." "Why?" "Because I think we've been fighting the wrong battle. We've been trying to change people's minds about our policies, but we haven't been thinking about how people form opinions in the first place." Over the next 2 weeks, Jasmine met with tech executives, content creators, and social media researchers. What she learned was both fascinating and disturbing. "The algorithm doesn't care about truth," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher at Stanford's Internet Observatory. "It cares about engagement and what drives engagement: anger, outrage, fear, tribal loyalty. So the system is literally designed to show people the most inflammatory version of everything?" "Exactly. If there's a video of you giving a thoughtful, nuanced explanation of healthcare policy and another video of you in a heated exchange with a Republican, which one do you think gets more views?" "The heated exchange." "And which one does the algorithm promote to more people?" "The heated exchange." "And what impression does that give people about who you are and what you stand for?" Jasmine sat back in her chair. "That I'm an angry, divisive politician who only cares about fighting." Now, multiply that effect across millions of Americans and hundreds of politicians. The pieces were falling into place. The interview with Rogan had worked precisely because it had bypassed this broken system. For 3 hours, people had heard her actual voice, her actual thoughts, without the distorting filter of algorithmic amplification. But there was another revelation waiting for her. The following week, Jasmine received a call from an unexpected source: Tucker Carlson's production team. "Representative Crockett, Mr. Carlson would like to invite you on his show." Jasmine was stunned. Carlson had spent years portraying her as everything wrong with modern politics. "Why now?" "He said he was impressed by your interview with Joe Rogan. He wants to have a similar conversation." "And by similar, you mean longer format, more substantive, less combative?" Jasmine thought about it for a moment. "Tell Mr. Carlson I'll consider it under one condition." "What's that?" "No interruptions, no gotcha clips, and no editing that takes my words out of context." "I'll pass that along." She never did appear on Carlson's show. His team ultimately decided that her conditions were too restrictive. But the invitation itself spoke to something larger happening in media. Other podcasters and interview shows began reaching out. Some were sincere attempts at dialogue. Others were clearly hoping to recreate the viral moment of the Rogan interview. Jasmine turned down most of them, but she did accept a few that seemed genuinely interested in substantive conversation. Each appearance reinforced the same lesson. When people heard her speak for herself, without intermediaries or interpreters, their opinions often shifted, not necessarily toward agreement with her positions, but toward respect for her reasoning. The real test came 6 weeks after the Rogan interview, when Jasmine was invited to speak at a town hall in rural Pennsylvania. The invitation came from an unlikely source, a group of Trump voters who had heard the Rogan interview and wanted to meet her in person. "We don't expect to agree with you about everything," the organizer told her over the phone, "but we want to hear you out." Jasmine almost turned it down. Rural Pennsylvania wasn't exactly friendly territory for a progressive black woman from Texas, but then she remembered her grandmother's words. "I spoke anyway, and I spoke my truth, not theirs." The town hall was held in a high school gymnasium in a town of 3,000 people. About 200 people showed up: farmers, factory workers, retirees, young families. The demographics were about what you'd expect: overwhelmingly white, mostly older, clearly skeptical. But something different happened that night. Instead of shouting or protesting, people listened. They asked hard questions, but they asked them respectfully. And when Jasmine gave her answers, they listened to those too. "I still don't agree with your position on gun control," said one farmer during the Q&A, "but I understand why you hold it, and I respect that you're willing to come here and explain it to us instead of just writing us off." "I appreciate you saying that," Jasmine replied, "and I hope you understand that disagreeing with your position doesn't mean I don't respect your concerns." After the event, the local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Liberal Congresswoman finds common ground with conservative voters." But the real story was in the details: the handshakes afterward, the conversations that continued in the parking lot, the commitments from both sides to keep talking instead of just talking past each other. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jasmine herself. 3 days after the Pennsylvania town hall, she received a call from someone she'd never expected to hear from: Elon Musk. Representative Crockett, this is Elon. I saw clips from your Rogan interview and your town hall. I have a proposition for you." Jasmine was skeptical. Musk wasn't exactly known for his progressive politics. "What kind of proposition?" "I want to give you a platform, not on Twitter, something bigger. I'm thinking about creating a new format for political dialogue, long form, unedited, designed to actually inform people instead of just entertaining them." "Why me?" "Because you proved something with Rogan that I didn't think was possible anymore. You proved that Americans are still capable of changing their minds when presented with honest arguments." "And what would you get out of this?" "Maybe a democracy that actually functions. Look, I've got billions of dollars, but none of that matters if the country falls apart because we can't talk to each other anymore." Jasmine was intrigued despite herself. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A weekly show. You interview people from across the political spectrum: politicians, activists, business leaders, regular citizens. But here's the catch. Everyone agrees to the same rules you set with Rogan. No interruptions, no gotcha moments, no editing for conflict." Who would watch something like that? You'd be surprised. The Rogan interview has been downloaded over 100 million times. People are hungry for real conversation, Jasmine. They're just not getting it anywhere else. The conversation continued for another hour. By the end, Jasmine found herself agreeing to a pilot episode. But there was one more surprise waiting. 2 weeks later, as Jasmine was preparing for the pilot taping, she received an unexpected visitor in her congressional office. It was Joe Rogan himself. "I had to come see you in person," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Joe, what are you doing in Washington?" "I wanted to thank you and to apologize." "For what?" "For spending years platforming people who were spreading misinformation about people like you, for not doing my homework before I formed opinions, for using my influence irresponsibly." Jasmine studied his face. "You seem different." "I am different. That interview changed something in me. I realized I'd been so focused on being contrarian that I'd stopped being curious, so focused on questioning everything that I'd stopped listening to the answers." "So what now?" "Now I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. I want to use my platform to bring people together instead of driving them apart." Rogan reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been working on something, a new interview format, longer conversations, better research, more diverse guests. I want your input." As Jasmine flipped through his notes, she realized something remarkable was happening. The ripple effects from that single 3-hour conversation were creating waves she never could have imagined, not just changing individual minds, but changing the entire approach to political dialogue in America. "Joe," she said, looking up from the folder, "I think you might be onto something here. Does that mean you'll help?" "It means I think we all have a responsibility to try." And that, perhaps, was the real victory. Not the viral clips or the media coverage or the political points scored. The victory was in two people choosing curiosity over certainty, understanding over ideology, and bridge building over wall building. Because everyone thought Jasmine Crockett would get crushed on Joe Rogan's podcast. Instead, she did something much more powerful. She reminded America what real leadership looks like. 6 months after the Rogan interview that changed everything, Jasmine Crockett stood before a crowd of 3,000 people in Phoenix, Arizona. The energy in the arena was different from anything she'd experienced, curious rather than combative, hopeful rather than hostile. This wasn't a political rally, it was something entirely new. They called it the Common Ground Tour. The idea had emerged from her conversation with Joe Rogan in her congressional office. He'd connected her with a network of people frustrated with political discourse, former military officers, business leaders, and politicians from both parties who were tired of performative politics. "We're not here to agree on everything," Jasmine told the Phoenix crowd. "We're here to remember that we're all Americans first." Tonight's format featured Jasmine in conversation with former Republican Governor Sarah Martinez, a woman who had built her career opposing everything Jasmine stood for. The stage was set simply. 2 comfortable chairs, no podiums, no barriers between the speakers and audience. It was intentionally designed to feel like a living room conversation that just happened to have 3,000 witnesses. Yet, here they were, discussing immigration and healthcare without resorting to talking points. "Governor Martinez," Jasmine said, "you've said my approach to immigration is too lenient. Can you help me understand the real challenges you see?" Martinez paused thoughtfully. "Jasmine, I think where we differ isn't on the goal. We both want a system that's humane and effective. Where we differ is on methods." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with both women explaining their reasoning and finding areas of agreement. What struck the audience wasn't just the civility. It was the genuine curiosity each woman showed about the other's perspective. They weren't just waiting for their turn to speak. They were actually listening, processing, and sometimes even saying, "I hadn't thought about it that way." The audience gradually relaxed into genuine engagement. The breakthrough came during Q&A. A young man named David stood up, hands shaking. "6 months ago, I hated both of you. I thought Representative Crockett was a socialist and Governor Martinez was a racist." The arena fell silent. "But listening tonight, I realize I never knew what either of you actually believed. I only knew what other people told me you believed. And they were wrong." "David," Jasmine said gently, "what changed your mind?" "Hearing you explain your actual positions instead of just defending against attacks, and seeing you treat each other with respect. I forgot that was possible." Behind the scenes, the Common Ground Tour had inspired other political leaders. The format was being studied by political scientists, copied by local politicians, and discussed in editorial boards across the country. What had started as one woman's decision to appear on a controversial podcast was becoming a movement. Representative Mike Chen, a moderate Republican from Colorado, started hosting similar dialogue formats in his district. The results were remarkable. Increased voter turnout, improved approval ratings, and actual legislative progress. The movement faced criticism. Partisan media accused Jasmine of selling out. When a cable news host accused her of abandoning her principles, her response went viral. "My principles haven't changed. I still believe everyone deserves health care, a living wage, and equal treatment. But I've learned the best way to advance those principles isn't to demonize everyone who disagrees. It's to help them understand why these principles matter." The real test came when tragedy struck. A mass shooting at an Ohio college reignited the gun control debate. Cable news channels immediately went into their familiar routines: split screens, shouting matches, and politicians reading from prepared statements. Social media exploded with the usual partisan fury. But this time, Jasmine did something different. She called Senator Jim Bradley, a Republican from Texas and vocal gun rights advocate. "Jim, I know we disagree, but I think we need to talk. Jasmine, you want to ban guns, and I want to protect the Second Amendment. Actually, I want to prevent mass shootings, and I think you do too. Can we find a way to do that together?" Their 3-hour conversation led to something unprecedented: a joint town hall in suburban Ohio, 50 miles from the shooting. Instead of protests, they got thoughtful dialogue about America's most divisive issue. "We all want our children safe," Jasmine opened. "The question isn't whether we care. It's how we work together to make a difference." Bradley nodded. "Every mass shooting is a failure of our system. We can debate solutions, but we can't debate the problem." Gun owners spoke about fears of government overreach while expressing concern for public safety. Gun control advocates acknowledged legitimate concerns of rural Americans. What made the difference was the ground rules they'd established: no interrupting, no gotcha questions, no attempts to embarrass or trap anyone. When someone spoke from personal experience, whether it was losing a child to gun violence or relying on firearms for protection in a remote area, the room listened with respect. Most importantly, both politicians listened, really listened. The event didn't end with breakthrough legislation, but with something more valuable: a commitment to continue the conversation and approach the issue with the complexity it deserved. 3 months later, Bradley and Jasmine co-sponsored a modest gun safety bill with provisions both sides could support: improved mental health resources, better law enforcement, and enhanced school safety. It passed with bipartisan support, the first significant gun legislation in over a decade. As Jasmine watched the bill signing, her phone buzzed with a text from Joe Rogan. "This is what happens when we choose curiosity over certainty." She texted back, "You provided the platform. Everything else grew from there." But the moment that meant the most came later that evening. A handwritten note was delivered to her office from a teacher in Ohio. "Representative Crockett, I watched your town hall with Senator Bradley. For the first time in years, I have hoped that my students might inherit a country that knows how to solve its problems instead of just fighting about them." The transformation wasn't complete, but it was real and growing, one conversation at a time. America was remembering how to talk to itself again. And it all started with one woman who decided to meet people where they were, not where she wished they would be. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of honest dialogue to bridge divides, make sure to subscribe. We're sharing the conversations that matter, one story at a time.